bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 159. Brian, we're talking about consent. We've talked about this before with kind of the mythical social contract, right? And have we actually consented? But just a few weeks ago, the National Libertarian Party posted this tweet. They're very big on, getting people to run for office, and you got to vote for us so that we can be in all 50 states on the ballot. We got to maintain that threshold, and they're very election focused, very voting, which is fine, right? But that's kind of their shtick. And to clarify, I'm not a member. I don't think you're a member of that party either. No. They tweeted this. This was June 26th. They said, "Silence is consent. If you choose not to vote, then you are by default supporting the status quo."
Wow.
I was floored. I mean, as someone who calls himself a libertarian, lowercase L, not capital L, I was baffled that the National Libertarian Party would go so far as to say something like this. Brian, with your reaction, what's your concern with what they said?
I'm just trying to liken that to maybe some other situations. I don't know. Let's say you're traveling through the airport and someone in an official-looking uniform wants to touch every part of your body to make sure that you're okay to fly. If you don't say something about it, then you're saying it's okay.
Right.
Silence is consent. Now, there's risk in saying, hey, I don't like this, or I'd prefer that you don't do that. But, I mean, how far would they be willing to take it?
Maybe let's first talk briefly, Brian, about what is consent. I like to always turn to Merriam-Webster's 1828, not Merriam-Webster. This is back when it was just Webster. It was Noah Webster, 1828, kind of the first American dictionary. And this is how he defined consent. There's two options. The first is agreement of the mind to what is proposed or stated by another, or accord, hence a yielding of the mind or will to that which is proposed. That makes sense. That's what we think of when we think of consent. The second one he offers is accord of minds, agreement, unity of opinion. But fundamentally, what I really latch onto there is the yielding of the mind. You've proposed something, Brian. I'm yielding my mind in agreement. I'm like, yeah, let's go eat lunch there. Or, yeah, let's build this together. I've yielded my mind. We have unity. Right? Everyone would kind of agree that that's consent. How then is silence consent, right? Because you just pointed out a great example. I think of like a battered wife or someone who's being sexually violated. Like, you don't know what's in their mind. You don't know that they've yielded their mind just because they are not fighting back, just because they've not verbally said anything. There may be all sorts of things going on in their mind that prevent them or inhibit them from yielding their mind affirmatively, or in the case where they aren't actually consenting, they don't want to speak out. They don't want to fight back. They're worried about the repercussions. They're worried about consequences of if I push, if I say no, then X, Y, and Z will happen. All these things can be running through their mind. And just because they're silent doesn't mean they're consenting. I'm weirded out by what they said.
Well, consent, according to the definitions that you read, seems to imply that there is a voluntary aspect of it. In other words, that consent can't be coerced. It's not like somebody's, sticking a gun in your ribs and saying, hey, you agree, we're going to go have lunch at this place.
Right.
It's freely chosen. And of course, the proof of that, and I think Lysander Spooner and others would back me up on this, is, are you free to say no? Can you say no?
That's right.
And so in that respect, I mean, come on, we just celebrated Independence Day, and right there in big bold print in the Declaration of Independence, it talks about how governments derive their just powers, rather, from the consent of the governed.
Right.
Meaning the people have the right to say no.
And so this is an interesting point. I want to build on this, Brian. I'm glad you brought that up. So the second sentence in their tweet was, if you choose not to vote, then you are by default supporting the status quo. By abstaining to vote, you support the status quo. And yet many people argue the opposite, that if you are voting, that constitutes consent. When you and I would bring up and say, well, look, the Declaration says consent of the governed, they say, oh, yeah, you vote. You consent. And here we have the Libertarian Party saying the inverse of that, right? Like that you're consenting if you don't vote. It seems like everyone is projecting into our political system consent, where it doesn't, whether you vote, whether you don't vote, whether you agree with the outcome because it's what you voted for. Like if I vote, okay, let's break this down, Brian. I vote for Bob. And so I'm yielding my mind. I like everything Bob stands for. I consent to have Bob govern me and be in charge of, the political process over me. I'm consenting. But then Bob loses, and Bill wins instead. And Bill is a ruthless central planner who wields the iron fist of the state over me, raises my taxes, erodes my property rights, XYZ, everything else I hate. Have I consented to be ruled over by Bill because I expressed a preference to be ruled over by Bob?
I think that's a good example. I would use this example too. Let's say that for some weird reason, known only to me, I want to withdraw my consent from a system that I feel like is fleecing me or otherwise taking advantage of me. So in order to withdraw my consent, I need to go down and register and participate in the very system that I don't think is legitimate, thereby legitimizing that system in order to withdraw my consent. That doesn't make sense to me.
It's a bit of a catch-22. Brian, you brought up Lysander Spooner, and we can't talk about an issue like this without quoting him. I pulled up the quote that I wanted to share. Lysander Spooner, for those who aren't aware, was, if you don't know this guy, go Google him. And if you read nothing else that he's written or talked about, read the story of him trying to set up a post office in competition with the government's post office. Fascinating story. Congress was passing new laws to shut him down, and then he pivoted around that, so they passed another law to shut him down and finally came after him. Fantastic story. This guy put his money, his feet, where his mouth is. Here's the quote that he said about voting that I think is, Brian, very on point with what we're discussing. So I'm going to quote a little bit from him. He says, "In truth, in the case of individuals, their actual voting is not to be taken as proof of consent, even for the time being. On the contrary, it is to be considered that without his consent having even been asked, a man finds himself environed or surrounded by a government that he cannot resist, a government that forces him to pay money, render service, and forego the exercise of many of his natural rights, under peril of weighty punishments. He sees, too, that other men practice this tyranny over him by the use of the ballot. He sees further that if he will but use the ballot himself, he has some chance of relieving himself from this tyranny of others by subjecting them to his own." And that to me is just such a poetic explanation, but I want to share a little bit more because this is when he gets, I think, really into the precise issue at hand. He says he's analogizing it to a bit of self-defense, right? And so then he continues to say, his case is analogous to that of a man who has been forced into battle, where he must either kill others or be killed himself. Because to save his own life in battle, a man takes the lives of his opponents, it is not to be inferred that the battle is one of his own choosing, neither in contests with the ballot, which is a mere substitute for the bullet. Because as his only chance of self-preservation, a man uses a ballot, is it to be inferred that the contest is one into which he voluntarily entered, that he voluntarily set up all his own natural rights as a stake against those of others to be lost or won by the mere power of numbers? I'm just...
Wow.
Yeah, right? And that is so true, right? Because in my mind and Spooner's mind, I agree with him, it becomes a self-defense mechanism for those of us who are inclined to say, get off my lawn, right? Live and let live. And so there are many in the liberty movement, quote unquote, who abstain from voting and just think, as you point out, that it kind of legitimizes the system or that it doesn't do anything anyways. And that's all well and good. I hold no ill will, although the Libertarian Party does, against those type of people.
Apparently.
But I am one who does participate because I agree with the self-defense aspect. I don't want to be killed, and so I want to do whatever is in my power to minimize that against me. So, Brian, it seems to me that what Spooner is saying is just like radical to the core. But is he wrong?
I don't think he is. The truth can be radical sometimes. And you want to talk about radical. I'm sure you've seen the reaction if you encounter somebody who says, yeah, I don't vote anymore. What's the typical reaction people around him have? Are you nuts? Well, you have to vote. Or maybe the variation of, you have to choose one of these two candidates. I mean, like we saw in 2016.
Absolutely.
But I don't like either one of them. That's tough. You have to choose one. Do I?
It seems to me it's the political equivalent of telling someone you're leaving the faith, like going to mom and saying, I don't believe anymore, I'm not going to church, or, if you're in a religious family, as an example, and your religious family we're worried for your soul, and sure, that's sincere and whatever, right? It's not to knock that, but it's just to point out that the political analogy of that is I think often very similar. I mean, I remember as when I first started telling people I didn't pledge allegiance, right? I recently shared with a family member that when my entire church congregation stood up to sing the national anthem, or that I remained seated and silent in the front of my congregation, and had all the lasers of death boring into my back, I'm sure, from all my fellow congregants. But you share those things with people, and like exactly what you point out, there's like crazy reaction, right? But it's
because you're leaving the civic religion,
yeah,
or you're at least announcing that you're having a crisis of faith in the civic religion.
So then the missionaries are no doubt going to visit me and try and revitalize my faith. No, it's odd to me though that the Libertarian Party would offer this, because I don't think that voting constitutes consent, and I don't think that silence constitutes consent either. Do you remember the story, Brian, of Erwin Schiff, Peter Schiff's father? And Erwin Schiff was a longtime tax protester.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't think that the U.S. income tax was valid. He didn't think it applied to him. And on many occasions, he refused to pay the tax. And so he had numerous unsuccessful court battles. He was sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison at the age of 78. Okay. And by this time, he'd become legally blind. He was dying of cancer. He died at age 87, shackled to a hospital bed in a guarded room. And so in my mind, I think, imagine what would happen if the government validated the claims of a tax protester, right? Millions would immediately pursue that same course of action. So the government instead decides, well, no, we got to shut this down as a warning to other people. If you don't like paying your taxes, and if you speak out against it and attract that type of attention, then that might bring you the same fate. I share that example because there are many people who agree with Erwin Schiff. I know many of them. I probably sympathize very strongly myself, right? The income tax is unconstitutional and it is invalid. It does not apply to individual persons. But the U.S. government disagrees, and it's willing to use all the force at its disposal against anyone who stands up, kind of like whack-a-mole, right? And if you stand up, you're going to get knocked down. And so think of it. There are all these people who, all things being considered, do not consent to having a third of their income stolen by their government. All things, being equal, if they had the opportunity, they would resist, they would decline. They don't consent. They've not yielded the mind, but they're silent. Because they see what happened to Erwin Schiff. They see what's happened to some of these other very vocal tax protesters. They don't want that same fate. And so in that calculation for their own risk, they say, I'm just going to be silent. I'm going to harbor these thoughts on my own. I'll post anonymously online about it to vent or whatever, but they're silent. That's not consent to have a third of your money stolen just because you're silent.
No, it makes sense.
And for anyone to say otherwise, it's just stupid.
Maybe you remember, you've heard this, I'm sure, a few times. Well, if you don't vote, you have no room to complain. And George Carlin turned that on its head and said, no, actually, if I don't vote, I have every reason to complain because the mess is not my responsibility. I'm not the one who put this or that knucklehead in office. That was you. You're the one, because you voted, who doesn't have a right to complain. You participated in it. Now, some may find that cynical, but I think that actually rings a lot more true than, if you didn't participate in this reassurance ritual, then you have no room to complain.
You had the chance not to be abused, and because you didn't speak up, now that you're being abused, you can't complain that you're being abused.
You could have chosen to be shot in the head or shot in the stomach, but you didn't choose either one of them, so now you just have to take whatever we decide is best for you to be shot in.
You bring up a good point with the Carlin example, though, because even my neighbors, even our friends, people around the country, whatever, in our community, all these people who vote, if we're going to take the argument that that is consent, that they are yielding the mind, I'm voting for Bob, and, Bob's great. But Bob can go against his word and do all sorts of things that he promised not to do, or not do things that he promised to do. And so we're voting, but we all know that the system is so screwed up like this. We all know that candidates go back on their word. We all know that all these promises that they're throwing out, even the free college thing we talked about every episode, right? You can promise all these things on the campaign trail that you can never fulfill. And so people yielded their mind for X, Y, and Z on the flyer they got in the mail or the TV ad that they saw. That's what they're yielding their mind to. They've now voted. So even in cases where the guy that they elected won, or the gal, let's be politically correct, the non-gender stereotyped person won, that person can then do different things. Has that person who successfully got that guy or gal in office consented to whatever that person then does? That is, no, it's that candidate now has political control and they're free to do whatever they want with it. So that this idea that consent matches up with voting, I think is not very valid. I think we've seen that it's not valid with silence as well.
I think you've just explained perfectly why I have such a crisis of faith in voting, or actually in most things political, as solutions. I think what you outlined earlier about sometimes you have to fight a defensive action, and I think that's where I find myself when I go into the voting booth, and yes, I do vote, I'm simply trying to use whatever influence I have as wisely as I can, not because, I'm throwing my full support behind this candidate or that candidate and all of their policy decisions to be made in the future, but simply because I think they'll do less damage than whoever is currently there.
If you guys are intrigued by what we've discussed here today, I would humbly point you to Lessons from a Lemonade Stand, a book that I wrote a year or two ago that is targeted more for teens and young adults who are new to a lot of these political concepts. But we really tackle this idea of consent. We talk about it in the context of silence. We talk about it in the context of voting. We talk about it in the context of moving. A lot of people will say, well, you live here, therefore you consent to the state ruling over you. And right, so there's all these ideas that have come up. And so we tackle them one by one, especially for the young adults in your life or even yourself. If you're curious to learn more, would encourage you to go to Amazon, look up Lessons from a Lemonade Stand. We'll link to it on today's show notes page, societyandthestate.com/159, and hope to see you guys on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.